On the morning of April 23, 1973, a payphone in Pueblo, Colorado, rang at the Santa Cruz Police Department. The voice on the line was calm, clear, and immediately recognizable to the officers who answered it. It was Big Ed, Edmund Kemper, the 6'9", 300-pound regular at the jury room bar on Main Street, the guy who drank with the detectives after their shifts and talked shop about the murder cases they were working. He was calling to confess. He told them he had killed his mother 4 days earlier. He had bludgeoned her while she slept, then decapitated her, then used her larynx as a garbage disposal, feeding it into the machine as a way of expressing what he felt about the years of criticism and emotional abuse she had inflicted on him. He told them he had then called his mother's best friend, a woman named Sally Hallett, and invited her to dinner. She had come over, happy and unsuspecting. He had strangled her when she arrived. He had fled to Colorado. The officer who took the call did not believe him. Big Ed was a regular. Big Ed was friendly. Big Ed had been to the department's Christmas party. Big Ed knew the investigators by name, knew the details of their cases, had discussed criminal psychology with them in the bar. Big Ed was not a serial killer. Kemper called back. He called multiple times, adding details, providing corroborating information, asking them to please come and arrest him because he was afraid of what he might do next if they didn't. It took several calls before the Santa Cruz Police Department sent officers to pick him up. When they arrived, they found Edmund Kemper waiting calmly in a phone booth. He had not fled. He had not disappeared. He had called them, explained who he was and what he had done, and then waited. He had also, when they processed him and searched the apartment he had fled, left behind evidence of the 6 young women he had killed in the preceding 10 months. Women whose disappearances had been generating exactly the kind of investigative pressure that had filled those late-night conversations at the jury room bar, where Big Ed sat and listened and bought rounds and absorbed everything the detectives were telling him about the investigation they were conducting into the crimes he had committed. He had been drinking with the people who were looking for him. He had known what they knew. He had been 1 step ahead for 10 months. This is the story of Edmund Kemper. Edmund Emil Kemper III was born on December 18, 1948 in Burbank, California, a city in the San Fernando Valley northeast of Los Angeles, organized around the entertainment industry in the specific way of communities that exist in proximity to Hollywood. He was the middle child of Edmund Emil Kemper II, a World War II veteran who had survived combat testing atomic bombs in the Pacific, and then come home to find that marriage to Clarnell Elizabeth Strandberg was, as he reportedly described it, harder than anything he had encountered in the war. Clarnell Kemper was, by multiple accounts and by Edmund's own extensive testimony in decades of interviews, a complicated and damaging woman. She was an alcoholic whose emotional volatility expressed itself primarily through the people closest to her, through contempt, through withering criticism, through a specific quality of cruelty that was organized around her children and her husband's inadequacy. She berated her husband for his menial job as an electrician in front of the children. She was erratic and unpredictable in the way of alcoholics, so that the household never settled into the specific dread of consistent abuse, but remained instead in the exhausting uncertainty of not knowing which version of her would come home on any given evening. She refused to show Edmund physical affection. She said she was afraid it would make him homosexual. This was not an unusual fear in the 1950s, but the specific way she acted on it, withdrawing physical warmth from her son while simultaneously subjecting him to sustained emotional abuse, produced a combination that researchers who have studied his case have spent decades analyzing. She made him sleep in the basement when he was a child, because she was afraid of what he might do to his sisters. She locked the door. He was a child who was being told by his mother that he was dangerous and could not be trusted. that the ordinary childhood act of being in a room with his sisters required a locked door between them. Whether this created something that would not otherwise have existed, or whether it reflected an accurate intuition about what was already developing in him, is a question that the available record cannot answer. What it did, unambiguously, was tell a developing child that he was a threat rather than a person. His father left when Edmund was 7. The marriage had been unsustainable, and Edmund Sr.'s way of resolving it was to leave, to walk out of the household and establish a new life with another woman, leaving Edmund, his mother, and his sisters in Montana, far from anything they had known in California. Montana was cold and remote and offered nothing to a child who was already socially isolated. Edmund had no friends of consequence. He was too tall too early, growing faster than other children in ways that made him conspicuous and awkward. He was also clearly, in the assessments of the people around him, exceptionally intelligent. But the intelligence had nowhere particular to go in the specific Montana environment of his childhood, and it turned inward, feeding the fantasy life that was already developing. The fantasies involved death. They had always involved death, in the specific way that disturbed children sometimes report, the imagined scenarios of violence that most children occasionally experience and that most children can dismiss, but that in Edmund became insistent and specific and returned. He decapitated his sister's dolls. He asked his sister Ruth, who was younger, to play a game she called Gas Chamber. He would pretend to be executed, and she was to watch. He described the game later, in interviews, with the specificity of someone who remembers it well. He buried the family cat alive. When the cat was dug up still alive, he cut its head off. He kept the head. His mother, frightened by these behaviors, sent him to live with his father in California. His father, remarried and not eager for the complication, sent him to his paternal grandparents in North Fork, a small community in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. His grandfather, Edmund Kemper Sr., was a quiet man who lived on a small farm and who appears, in the accounts, as a gentle and unremarkable presence. His grandmother, Maud Kemper, was another domineering woman, not as extreme as his mother, but critical and controlling in ways that Edmund found insufferable, or that triggered in him the specific responses that his mother had spent years conditioning. He and his grandmother fought. He resented her. He fantasized about her. On August 27, 1964, 6 days before his 15th birthday, he shot his grandmother 3 times with a .22 caliber rifle as she sat at the kitchen table. She was correcting his homework. He shot her in the head and in the back. He stood over her body and understood what he had done. When his grandfather came home from grocery shopping a short while later and pulled into the driveway, Edmund shot him too. He said later that he had not wanted his grandfather to find her. He did not explain this as mercy. It was not mercy, exactly. It was the specific logic of someone who had done something irrevocable and was managing the immediate consequences. He called his mother. She told him to call the police. He called the police. He was 15 years old. He was committed to the Atascadero State Hospital as a criminally insane juvenile. He would spend the next 5 years learning how to pass every assessment they gave him. In Atascadero, Edmund Kemper was, by the accounts of the clinical staff, an exceptional patient. He was cooperative, articulate, engaged with the therapeutic process in ways that genuinely impressed the people administering it. He worked in the hospital's psychological testing unit, which gave him access not only to the tests themselves, but to the norms, the scoring, the specific mechanics of what the assessments were designed to measure and what responses produced the outcomes that were considered indicators of improvement. He was learning from the inside how to appear rehabilitated. He had an IQ of 145. He was paying attention. The specific irony of the Atascadero years, which Kemper himself acknowledged in subsequent interviews with the characteristic self-awareness that made him such an unusual research subject, was that the institution that was supposed to assess him was itself teaching him how to be assessed. He absorbed the psychological literature. He understood the frameworks. He knew what organized versus disorganized meant long before the FBI developed the terminology, because he had been living inside the clinical environment that produced those categories. In 1969, when he was 21 years old, the California Youth Authority recommended his release. The psychiatrists concluded that he was no longer a danger to himself or others. One of his treating physicians noted in the case record that returning Edmund to his mother's custody was inadvisable, that the specific dynamic between mother and son was dangerous, and that reuniting them would be unwise. The recommendation was overridden. He was released to exactly that custody. He went to live with his mother in Santa Cruz. The doctor who had recommended against this was correct. It was a university town. The University of California had established a campus there in 1965, which had brought a specific population of students and faculty and the surrounding culture of the counterculture California coast. It was also, in the early 1970s, one of the most dangerous places in California. A cluster of serial murders was occurring simultaneously, involving at least 3 separate killers operating in and around the Santa Cruz area, a coincidence so extraordinary that the city earned, briefly and grimly, the designation murder capital of the world. One of those killers was Edmund Kemper, though the investigators of the Santa Cruz murders did not know this yet. Kemper lived with his mother and worked various jobs, including, eventually, a position with the California Division of Highways, which gave him a state vehicle and access to the roads and remote mountain areas of the Santa Cruz region. He enrolled briefly in community college. He applied to become a California Highway Patrol officer. He had been interested in law enforcement since Atascadero, had read extensively in the field, had developed what appeared to be a genuine intellectual engagement with criminal psychology. The CHP rejected him. He was 6'9". The maximum height requirement for CHP officers had been established with a specific reason, and Kemper significantly exceeded it. He did the next best thing. He went to the bar where the cops drank. The jury room on Main Street was where the detectives and uniformed officers of the Santa Cruz Police Department went after their shifts. It was a working cops bar. Nothing fancy, nothing dive, the specific functional middle ground where the dress code was whatever you arrived in and the conversation was professional because everybody there did the same work. Kemper began going to the jury room. He was enormous and good-natured and interesting to talk to. He knew things. He asked good questions. He bought rounds. He was interested, genuinely, or performing interest so convincingly that the distinction ceased to matter, in how investigations worked, in how cases were built, in the specific challenges of working with limited resources and incomplete evidence. The detectives liked Big Ed. One of them gave him a training school badge. One of them lent him a pair of handcuffs. One of them, at some point while Kemper was actively killing, lent him a gun. The handcuffs particularly. A detective investigating the disappearances of young women in Santa Cruz County lent handcuffs to the man who was responsible for those disappearances. The detective did not know. He could not have known. But the specific image, the murder weapon supplied by the investigator's generosity, is one of the most disturbing details in a case that has many. The conversations at the jury room covered the murders. The detectives were working the disappearances that were generating pressure on the department, were following leads that went nowhere, were dealing with the specific frustration of cases that had evidence but no suspect. They talked about what they knew and what they were looking for and where the investigation was going. Kemper listened to every word. He was the most attentive audience they had, and he had started killing again in May of 1972. Mary Ann Pesce and Anita Lucchesa were both students at Fresno State College. On May 7, 1972, they were hitchhiking north on Highway 1 along the California coast, trying to get to Stanford, where a friend was living. Hitchhiking was common in California in the early 1970s. It was the specific geography of the counterculture: long distances, inadequate public transportation, a culture that had normalized the practice. Young women hitchhiked, young men hitchhiked. It was simply how people got around. Kemper drove a large sedan, a Ford Galaxy, that he had acquired during the period when he was picking up and releasing hitchhikers, testing what he could do and what stopped him. He had let many women go before he killed any. He later described this practice in the interviews he gave after his arrest: the calculation in the car, the decision he made or didn't make, the women he dropped off at their destinations without incident. He was, in these accounts, genuinely trying to understand himself, trying to identify the mechanism that distinguished one decision from the other. He drove Mary Ann Pesce and Anita Lucchesa to a remote location in the Santa Cruz Mountains. He killed them. He then transported their remains to his apartment, his mother's house where he lived, and spent time with them in ways that he described with clinical precision to the researchers who later interviewed him. He disposed of their heads in the Santa Cruz Mountains. He disposed of their bodies in ways designed to delay discovery. He went to the jury room the following week and talked to the detectives about their cases. Aiko Ku was 15 years old, a dance student who had missed her bus on September 14, 1972, and decided to hitchhike. She was on her way to a dance class in San Francisco. Kemper picked her up near Berkeley. He described in his interviews the specific conversation they had in the car, the way she talked to him about her life, her interests, her family. He described deciding that she would not make it to San Francisco. After killing Aiko Ku, he drove to a psychiatric appointment, a mandatory check-in with the psychiatrists who were monitoring his release from Atascadero. He had her remains in the trunk of the car during the appointment. The psychiatrists assessed him as no longer dangerous. Cindy Scholl was 18 years old, a student at Cabrillo College. She disappeared in January of 1973. Kemper had hidden parts of her body in the Santa Cruz Mountains, in locations he knew from his work with the Division of Highways. Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu were both students at UC Santa Cruz. He killed them both on the same day in February of 1973. 6 women in 10 months, all hitchhiking, all killed in his car or in the Santa Cruz Mountains. All disposed of in ways that reflected his knowledge of the terrain and his understanding of what investigators would look for. One detail about Aiko Ku requires its own sentence. After killing her and placing her remains in the trunk of his car, he drove to a mandatory psychiatric appointment, a condition of his release from Atascadero, a routine check-in with the clinicians who were monitoring his adjustment to civilian life. He sat across from the psychiatrist and answered questions about his state of mind. He was calm, cooperative, and appropriate. He was assessed as no longer dangerous. Aiko Ku's remains were in the trunk of his car in the parking lot during the appointment. He drove away afterward. He went to the Santa Cruz Mountains. He disposed of her remains. He went to the jury room that week and talked to the detectives about how the checkpoint had gone. The relationship with his mother had continued throughout this period in the specific way that it had always been. Clarnell Kemper was, in Santa Cruz, working as an administrative assistant at the University of California campus, a job she had obtained through her own persistence and that she was proud of. She lived in a modest house. She was in her mid-40s and had been through 3 marriages and a lifetime of instability, and she was trying in Santa Cruz to build something that worked. She was also still his mother in the ways that had always been true. She criticized him. She berated him. She expressed her low opinion of his abilities and his social skills and his prospects in the specific cutting way that she had refined over 25 years of practice. She reminded him regularly of everything she found insufficient about him. She drank. The gap between the person she saw, the underachieving, socially awkward, oversized son who was living in her house and working a state job, and the person who was sitting at the jury room buying rounds for the detectives and being liked and admired, was absolute. She had spent his entire life telling him what was wrong with him. The detectives had spent months telling him what was impressive about him. He could not leave his mother. He had tried, briefly, had spent time living in an apartment after his release from Atascadero, had tried to establish something independent. It had not lasted. He had come back to her house. He could not stop his mother from being what she was. He found another way to manage what she generated in him. The 6 young women he killed between May 1972 and February 1973 were, in his own account, not substitutes for his mother. He rejected that interpretation consistently and with some irritation when interviewers offered it. The relationship between the murders and his relationship with his mother was more complex and less directly symbolic than the pop psychology framing suggested. But the murders did serve a specific function. They gave him something that the relationship with his mother denied him: power, possession, the complete control over another person that his life had never otherwise offered him. He describes, in his interviews, picking up women, hitchhiking, and driving them for miles before deciding what to do. Sometimes releasing them, sometimes not. He made the decision in the car, based on factors he could not entirely articulate, in a process that he describes as both deliberate and compulsive. He knew what he was, and he knew what he was capable of, and he drove the highways of the Santa Cruz area with the knowledge of both. He also, in those months, visited his mother. He ate dinner with her. He had conversations with her. He went to the jury room and drank with the detectives. He maintained all 3 lives simultaneously: the state employee, the murder bar regular, and the killer, for 10 months. He killed his mother on April 20th, 1973. Good Friday. He bludgeoned her with a hammer while she slept. He decapitated her. He committed acts with her remains that he described later in clinical terms that the researchers who interviewed him found useful and that most readers find unbearable. He used her larynx as a garbage disposal. He said this was because of everything she had said to him. Then he called Sally Hallett, his mother's best friend and neighbor. He invited her over for dinner. She was delighted. She arrived the following day. He strangled her when she walked through the door. He then did something that many people who have studied the case find as significant as the murders themselves. He called some of his friends from the jury room. He went drinking. He came back to the house where his mother and Sally Hallett were dead. He drove east. He had no plan. He drove. In Pueblo, Colorado, he stopped at a payphone. He called Santa Cruz. He told the officer who answered his name and what he had done. He was calm. He was specific. He gave details. The officer recognized the voice. He knew Big Ed from the jury room. He could not make the voice and the information coexist. He did not believe it. Kemper called back. He provided more details: the location of evidence, the specific circumstances of the murders, things that only the responsible person could know. He described crimes. He connected disappearances that had been treated as unrelated. He called multiple times from the same phone booth, adding information with each call, waiting for the person on the other end to understand that this was real. They sent officers to Pueblo. He was in the phone booth when they arrived. He had not moved. He had not attempted to leave or to put any distance between himself and the calls he had been making. He was waiting, with the specific patience of someone who has completed something and knows what comes next. When the Santa Cruz investigators arrived, they found Edmund Kemper cooperative and apparently relieved. He shook hands with people he recognized. He had waived his Miranda rights twice before they arrived. He began talking before they could ask. He spent hours describing everything: the crimes in order, the methods, the specific decisions, the disposal, the psychological states preceding each killing. He took them to locations in the Santa Cruz Mountains where he had hidden remains. He resolved disappearances that had been open investigations. He connected evidence that had been unconnected. He was, the investigators said afterward, the most cooperative subject any of them had ever interviewed. He had called them himself. He had called them back when they didn't believe him. He had waited in the booth. He told them everything. He was waiting for them. The detectives who flew to Colorado to take him into custody included men he had drunk with at the jury room. He greeted them. He was cooperative in the way he had always been cooperative. He waived his Miranda rights twice and spent hours talking, providing information, describing what he had done in the methodical and comprehensive way that his intelligence and his apparent need to be understood made possible. He took them to locations where he had disposed of remains. He described crimes that had previously been treated as unconnected. He added the killings to the record of his grandmother and grandfather from 1964, producing a total of 10 murders, a body count that would be established over the following days and weeks as investigators confirmed the details. He was charged with 8 counts of murder. The grandparents' killings had occurred when he was a juvenile and were handled separately. He was convicted on all 8 counts in November of 1973 and sentenced to life in prison. He asked to be executed. California did not have the death penalty at the time. The Supreme Court had effectively suspended it the previous year. He was sentenced to life imprisonment instead and sent to the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. He is still there. Edmund Kemper, who turned 76 years old in December of 2024, is one of the longest-serving prisoners in the California correctional system, and by all available accounts, one of its most unusual. He has been at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville for over 50 years. He is described by prison staff, consistently and over a long period, as a model prisoner, cooperative, helpful, engaged with the institutional environment in the same way he was engaged with the Atascadero environment in the 1960s, with the same apparent investment in being seen positively and the same apparent success in achieving that impression. He reads extensively. He has done volunteer work within the prison. He has participated in programs. He has been denied parole at every hearing. The parole denials are not controversial. The district attorney's office and the families of his victims have consistently and effectively argued against his release. There is no realistic prospect of Edmund Kemper being released from Vacaville. He has been institutionalized with one exception since he was 15 years old, and the one exception produced 10 murders. In the 1970s and 1980s, he gave extensive interviews to FBI agents who were developing what would become the behavioral science unit's approach to criminal profiling. Robert Ressler and John Douglas, the agents most associated with the development of criminal profiling, both conducted extended interviews with Kemper during this period. He was, among the subjects they interviewed, unusually valuable, articulate, self-aware, apparently honest about his psychology and his crimes, and capable of describing the internal experience of a certain type of killer in ways that produced genuinely useful investigative frameworks. The organized/disorganized killer typology, the foundational categorization in the FBI's profiling methodology, was developed in part from these interviews. The concept of the killer who plans, who maintains a job and a social life, who selects victims based on opportunity within a specific geographic and demographic range, who manages evidence deliberately. This is the organized killer. And Edmund Kemper is one of its defining examples in the research literature. He helped build the tools that investigators use to catch people like him. He did this apparently sincerely, in the same way he apparently sincerely described his crimes to the researchers. In the same way, he apparently sincerely called the Santa Cruz Police Department from a phone booth in Colorado and asked them to come and arrest him. He is a person who, in his own complex and disturbing way, seems to mean what he says. The Netflix series Mindhunter depicted a version of Edmund Kemper as a central character in its first season, with the actor Cameron Britton playing him. The performance was widely praised for capturing the specific quality that emerges from the research literature, the combination of size and gentleness, intelligence and self-awareness, the disarming conversational ease that makes him simultaneously fascinating and deeply uncomfortable to be around. Kemper has said he found the portrayal accurate. He has also recorded audiobooks. His reading voice is clear and measured and professionally competent, and the recordings are available in various formats. This is either entirely mundane or entirely disturbing, depending on how you think about it. He has said in various interviews over the decades that he no longer experiences the violent urges that preceded and accompanied the murders. He has said that killing his mother, the act that he had been building toward for years, the resolution of whatever the specific damage of that relationship had produced, resolved the compulsion. Researchers have found his account consistent with other cases in the literature of escalating violence toward a primary target. They cannot verify it. He is 76 years old. He is a model prisoner. He is in Vacaville. The families of his 10 victims are alive or not, and carrying what they carry or not. The researchers who interviewed him and built their careers partly on what he told them are retired or deceased. The detectives who drank with him at the jury room are old or gone. The jury room is still open on Main Street in Santa Cruz. Edmund Kemper called to confess and had to call back several times because they didn't believe him. He is still waiting in Vacaville for whatever comes next. The Edmund Kemper case presents, for researchers and for anyone who engages with it seriously, a specific and uncomfortable challenge. It does not resolve into any of the frameworks that serial killer cases typically offer. He was not a disorganized killer operating on impulse. He planned. He prepared. He managed evidence with sophistication. He passed psychiatric evaluations and manipulated systems and maintained a functional social life throughout his murders. He was not a killer whose crimes were invisible to those around him. The detectives at the jury room were working the cases he was responsible for. They were discussing the evidence with him. They were close to him, genuinely close, in the way of people who drink together regularly and find each other's company pleasant. They did not see it. He is not a person who denies his crimes or rationalizes them into innocence. He confessed everything in exhaustive detail and has continued to discuss his crimes with researchers for 50 years. He has contributed to our understanding of how people like him think and operate. He helped build the tools investigators use. He is also the person who killed 10 people, including his grandparents when he was 15, and who said he killed his grandmother because he wanted to see what it felt like. These things are all true, simultaneously, about the same person. The challenge is not to explain how they can coexist. The research literature has frameworks for that, involving the specific psychological architecture of the organized killer and the way that high intelligence can coexist with profound moral pathology. The challenge is to sit with the fact that they do coexist, and that the coexistence is not academic. It is embodied in a specific person who is alive at 76 years old in a California prison. and who can be called and interviewed, and who will answer questions with the same precision and apparent candor that he has demonstrated for 50 years. He helped write the book on how to find people like him. He is the most self-aware serial killer in the history of American criminal psychology. Whether self-awareness is the same as remorse is a question he has been asked many times, and that he has answered in ways that satisfy researchers without satisfying the families of his victims. He drank with the detectives. He waited in a phone booth in Colorado. He is still in Vacaville. The jury room is still open. There is a specific and unusual quality to the Edmund Kemper case that distinguishes it from the other cases in this project, and that the researchers who have studied him have spent considerable effort describing without entirely capturing. Most serial killers, when studied, present as people whose inner lives are opaque, who deny, minimize, rationalize, or are genuinely unable to articulate what drove them to do what they did. The research on most killers is an exercise in inference. You have the crimes, you have the circumstances, you have the psychology as best as it can be reconstructed from behavior, and you build a picture from those elements because direct access to the subjective experience is not available. Edmund Kemper gives you direct access. He talks. He has been talking in extended interviews with researchers and journalists and documentary filmmakers for 50 years. He describes his inner life with a precision and a consistency that researchers have cross-checked against other available evidence and found accurate in the ways that can be verified. He is, as a research subject, without precedent in the field. What he describes in those interviews is the inner life of a person who understood what he was doing and did it anyway. Not in the way of someone who lacked impulse control, not in the way of someone who was disconnected from reality. He was connected to reality. He understood the legal and moral character of his acts. He understood that what he was doing was wrong in the way that the law and the society he lived in defined wrong. He understood that the women he killed were people whose deaths mattered to other people. He described all of this with clarity. He killed them anyway. The researchers who have worked with him, Robert Ressler and John Douglas and Ann Burgess and the others who conducted the FBI interviews in the 1970s and 1980s, were not building a theoretical model in the abstract when they developed their profiling frameworks. They were sitting across from Edmund Kemper and asking him to explain himself, and they were finding, to their significant discomfort, that he was able to do so. The organized killer, the type that the FBI's behavioral science unit defined and that the research literature has built on for 50 years, is defined by planning, by the management of evidence, by the maintenance of a functioning social life, by the selection of victims within a specific geographic and demographic range. Edmund Kemper is that type's most articulate and most cooperative representative. He told them how to find him. He told them this after calling the police himself and waiting in a phone booth in Colorado for them to come and get him. He told them how to find the next person like him. He helped make the tool. He remains the most striking demonstration of what the tool is trying to detect. A person who is, in every observable social context, not visibly different from the people around him. Who buys drinks? Who is friendly? Who is interested in your work and asks good questions? Who is, in the specific vocabulary of the people who knew him, a gentle giant? Who has in the car outside the bar, in the trunk of the car he drives to his mandatory psychiatric appointment, something that cannot be detected from the bar stool. He was liked. He is still in Vacaville. He is 76 years old. He told them everything. Before the final accounting, the people he killed deserve more than a list. Mary Ann Pesch was 20 years old, studying at Fresno State, hitchhiking north on Highway 1 on her way to visit a friend at Stanford. First victim. Her family waited months for her to be found. Anita Lucchesa was 18, hitchhiking with Mary Ann that same day. Second, same afternoon, same car. Aiko Ku was 15 years old, a dance student who had missed her bus. Third, her remains were in Kemper's trunk during the psychiatric appointment where the clinician assessed him as no longer dangerous. Cindy Shaw was 18, a student at Cabrillo College. Fourth, parts of her body were found on beaches in Monterey County. Rosalind Thorpe was 23. Alice Liu was 21. Both UC Santa Cruz students. Both killed the same day in February of 1973. Fifth and sixth, Clarnell Kemper was 52 years old. She was his mother. Whatever she was to him, she was a person. She died in her bed on Good Friday morning. Sally Hallett was 59 years old. She was Clarnell's best friend. She came to dinner. She was killed at the door. 10 people, counting the grandparents, from 1964. The California Youth Authority released Edmund Kemper in 1969 over one clinician's explicit objection. That clinician noted the specific danger of returning him to his mother. The board overrode the recommendation. He killed 10 people. The clinician was right. The system was wrong. The same kind of system is making the same kind of assessments today, with better tools than existed in 1969, and with Edmund Kemper's 50 years of interviews somewhere in the training literature of the clinicians doing the assessing. He killed 10 people. The clinician was right. The system was wrong. There is a specific quality to what Edmund Kemper was doing during the 10 months of the murders that the research literature on serial killers finds unusual, and that the popular accounts of his case tend to either over-dramatize or under-examine. He was not hiding. He was not in disguise. He was not living a double life in the conventional sense, in the sense of a person who presents one face to the world and conceals another behind it. He was living multiple lives simultaneously, without compartmentalization breaking down, without any of the lives contaminating any of the others. He went to work in the morning. He drove the highways of the Santa Cruz area in the state vehicle, doing the job that gave him access to the terrain and the routes and the remote locations that his crimes required. He ate lunch. He finished his shift. He went to the jury room in the evenings and drank with the detectives and talked about their cases. He listened to everything they said. He processed it against what he knew about those cases, which was complete because he was responsible for them. He offered no information that would have helped. He asked questions that were interpreted as curiosity and that were actually data collection. He bought rounds. He was liked. He went home to his mother. He endured whatever the evening at his mother's house produced. Her criticism, her opinions, her presence in the specific and oppressive way that she had been a presence in his life since he was 7 years old. He picked up hitchhikers on the highway. He killed some of them and released others based on criteria he has described but never fully explained. He went back to the jury room. For 10 months, this was his life. And in none of the 3 contexts, the job, the bar, the highway, did any of the other contexts leak through. The detectives at the jury room did not see a killer. His mother did not see a killer. The hitchhikers who were released did not see a killer. They saw a large, polite man who gave them a ride and dropped them where they needed to go and said goodbye. The ones who were not released could not report what they had seen. This is the specific quality of the organized killer that Kemper helped the FBI articulate: the absence of leakage between contexts, the ability to be genuinely and completely whoever the current situation requires, with no bleed through from the other situations. The detective at the bar and the person who puts a body in the trunk before driving to a psychiatric appointment are not two versions of the same person engaging in a performance. They are the same person operating in different contexts, and in both contexts, the operation is complete and authentic. He was not performing being Big Ed, the gentle giant who bought rounds at the jury room. He was Big Ed. He was also Edmund Kemper, who killed 10 people. The researchers who spent decades trying to understand how these two things could be true of the same person have produced frameworks that are technically accurate and clinically useful, and that still leave you, at the end, with the specific discomfort of a question that has been answered but not resolved. How do you find someone like this before they do what they do? You develop better tools. You train better clinicians. You build better databases and better assessment instruments and better interagency communication. You do all the things that the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, which Kemper helped build, has been working on for 50 years. And somewhere, the next organized killer is sitting at a bar with the investigators who are working the cases he is responsible for, and he is buying rounds, and he is being liked. He is, in the specific vocabulary of the people who know him, a gentle giant. He has something in the trunk of his car. The tools will catch him, maybe. He told them everything. Edmund Kemper is alive. He was 76 years old in December of 2024. He is in the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, where he has been since his conviction in 1973. He has been institutionalized, with one exception, since he was 15 years old. The one exception produced 10 murders. His case has shaped American criminal psychology in ways that are measurable and documented. The FBI Behavioral Science Unit's foundational work, the organized/disorganized typology, the criminal profiling methodology that has been applied to thousands of cases over 50 years, was built partly on his interviews. The researchers who conducted those interviews, Robert Ressler and John Douglas, both wrote books that described him as the most useful and the most disturbing subject they worked with. He was useful because he talked. He was disturbing because he talked. He has been talking for 50 years. He has been denied parole every time he has come up for review. He will almost certainly die in Vacaville. The California criminal justice system that released him in 1969 has not released him since, and the families of his victims, who appear at every parole hearing, have made clear that they will continue to oppose release for as long as he lives. He has asked in various interviews whether the researchers who study him find it strange that he helps them, whether the combination of his crimes and his cooperation produces a kind of irresolvable contradiction for them, whether they think about what they owe him for the information and whether they think about what he owes the people he killed. He asks these questions with genuine curiosity and without apparent distress. He is, in the end, exactly what the research literature on organized killers describes: a person of high intelligence and specific psychological architecture who used those assets to kill 10 people, and then, with the same intelligence and the same architecture, to help investigators understand how to find the next person like him. He was liked. He was never caught. He called. He is in Vacaville. The jury room is still open on Main Street in Santa Cruz. Mary Ann Pesci would have been 73 years old this year. Aiko Ku would have been 67. They are still younger than him. He told them everything. There is one more thing to say about Edmund Kemper that the research literature tends to leave implicit, but that the case makes explicit. He is a demonstration that intelligence, self-awareness, and the capacity for genuine human connection are not protections against being a killer. They are not even indicators of not being one. He was genuinely liked. The detectives at the jury room liked him because he was likable. The psychiatric staff at Atascadero found him cooperative because he was cooperative. The researchers who interviewed him after his conviction found him fascinating and useful because he was fascinating and useful. These responses were accurate. He was all of those things. He was also the person who called back from the phone booth in Pueblo until they believed him. Both things are true. The case has no clean resolution. He is alive. The families of his victims are alive. The researchers who built their careers partly on what he told them are retired or deceased. The jury room is open. He is in Vacaville. He is 76 years old. He told them everything.